December 16th, 1944, early morning, Mona, Germany. The frozen ground shook as another round of American artillery flew overhead. But this morning felt different. Something terrifying and strange was happening. The shells weren't hitting the ground or trees as usual. Instead, they were exploding in the air, right above the advancing German troops, raining deadly metal fragments that no trench or foxhole could protect against. Among the soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadron, veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front faced a kind of firepower they had never seen before. These weren't the familiar artillery patterns they knew. No predictable blasts or safe zones. This was precise, calculated destruction from above. At that moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had made one of the boldest unauthorized choices of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Without asking permission, he ordered his men to load shells with the Allies' most closely guarded secret, proximity fuses. These small devices used radar to sense how close they were to a target and explode at the perfect height. This made artillery up to 50 times more deadly. The math of warfare was about to change forever in the frozen woods of the Ardennes. The German troops didn't know they had just encountered a weapon so advanced it would reshape not only this battle, but the future of war itself. Hitler's grand plan, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had started with high hopes. More than 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces were hidden in the fog-covered Ardennes. The goal was to split the Allied forces, retake Antwerp, and turn the war back in Germany's favor. The attack began at 5:30 a.m. with complete surprise. German guns fired about 1,600 shells per minute along an 85-mile front. American intelligence had missed all signs of the buildup, and many of the units in the line were either new recruits or tired veterans sent there to rest. At Monschau, Colonel Axelson faced a desperate situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being crushed by German numbers. Normal artillery couldn't stop them. Out of options, Axelson chose to use the secret shells without approval. He knew this could cost him his career or worse, but following orders would have meant certain defeat. The results were instant and shocking. German troops moving in tight formations suddenly found themselves under a kind of fire they had never imagined. Shells burst 30 to 50 feet above them, spreading fragments over a huge area. Soldiers who once knew how to hide from normal artillery were cut down even in foxholes, behind trees, and in ditches. Nowhere was safe. The secret weapon. The proximity fuse was one of America's greatest wartime inventions, a mix of science and industry at their best. Regular shells exploded only on impact or by timer, often at the wrong height. But the proximity fuse carried a tiny radar inside, no bigger than a coffee can. Each one held around 130 parts, including several mini vacuum tubes that could survive the enormous 20,000 G-shock of being fired from a cannon. The technology was mind-blowing. When the gun fired, the force broke a small glass capsule inside, activating a battery that powered the radar during flight. Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab led the project with the same urgency as the Manhattan Project. The lab, hidden in a fake used car lot in Maryland, employed about 3% of all American physicists. Security was so strict that workers couldn't tell their families what they did, and every fuse had its own serial number for tracking. The challenge seemed impossible at first. Radio tubes made for home radios had to be redesigned to survive being fired from guns, spin thousands of times per second, and still detect targets without exploding too soon. The breakthrough came with tiny, durable tubes made by Dr. James Van Allen, each no bigger than a pencil eraser but fully functional. By late 1944, American factories were turning out 40,000 of these fuses every day. More than 100 companies, from RCA and GE to Sylvania, were part of the effort. The program cost $1 billion in 1940s money, second only to the atomic bomb project. Orders broken, success gained. Axelson's decision on December 16th created immediate controversy. He had disobeyed orders that restricted the fuses to anti-aircraft guns, in case any were captured and studied by the Germans. But the results at Mona couldn't be ignored. The German attacks stopped cold, leaving heavy casualties. Reports of the new weapon's impact quickly reached headquarters. General Eisenhower, realizing how dire the situation in the Ardennes was, asked for permission to use proximity fuses across the front. By December 21st, restrictions were lifted, and the fuses were approved for all ground forces. What happened next showed how fast the U.S. Army could move. Within days, proximity fuse shells were delivered all across the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery at Bastogne received theirs just as German troops surrounded the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery used them to hold the northwest lines, and the 969th Battalion, an African-American unit led by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, used them to deadly effect southwest of Bastogne. Every American artillery unit soon realized the same thing. Proximity fuses changed everything. Artillery was no longer just support fire. It became a weapon that could decide battles on its own. Forward observers didn't have to be as precise anymore. The fuses figured out the best height to explode automatically. Accuracy mattered less, but the damage they caused multiplied dramatically. Bastogne, surrounded but standing strong. The siege of Bastogne showed how powerful these fuses could be when used defensively. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded and heavily outnumbered but refused to surrender the vital crossroads. Their artillery included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, which used 75mm pack howitzers firing proximity fuse shells. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds, according to their records. Not all used proximity fuses. Supplies were limited, but those that did caused total chaos among German troops. Entire enemy formations were wiped out in moments. On December 22nd, right after General McAuliffe's famous nuts response to the German surrender demand, the new shells proved their worth again. German soldiers advanced across open, snowy fields in close formation. The shells exploded high above them with perfect timing, blanketing the area with deadly fragments and leaving no place to hide. Another vital role was played by the all-black 969th Artillery Battalion. Their 155mm howitzers formed a deadly barrier around Bastogne that German troops couldn't break through. The larger shells, exploding around 50 feet above ground, scattered lethal fragments over huge areas. Captured German soldiers later admitted their units fell apart before even reaching the American lines. Many ran in panic at the sight and sound of the airbursts. The Sour River Massacre. The most thoroughly documented example of how deadly proximity fuses were came during a battle at the Sour River near Echternach on December 25th and 26th. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was pushing north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed what happened and wrote about it in War as I Knew It. A German battalion tried to cross the half-frozen river, believing the fog and darkness would hide them. Normally, it would have taken time for American gunners to adjust their fire, giving the Germans a chance to reach cover. But proximity fuse shells needed no adjustment. Patton described it simply: "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sour. The new shells were devastating. They exploded above them. There was nowhere to run. When it was over, we counted 702 bodies. That figure, 702 dead, stands as one of the few accurately recorded casualty counts from proximity fuse attacks. In just minutes, an entire battalion had been wiped out with no chance to fight back or escape. The psychological shock spread fast. Soon, other German units refused orders to cross the river at all. The forest becomes a trap. The dense woods of the Ardennes, which the Germans once trusted for cover, turned into killing zones once proximity fuses came into play. In open ground, an explosion 30 to 50 feet up was already deadly. But in the forest, the effects were multiplied. Airbursts tore through treetops, sending jagged branches flying at incredible speed. These splinters, some as long as a man's arm, became deadly projectiles themselves. Hiding behind trees or digging into roots no longer worked. The explosions came from above, destroying any sense of safety. Artillery crews quickly realized how much more destructive the blasts became in woods. A single 155mm shell exploding above the canopy could wipe out everything in an area the size of a tennis court. The combination of steel fragments and wooden splinters created a deadly ring of destruction all around. German troops trained for forest fighting found their skills useless. If they spread out, the shell fragments still reached them. If they grouped up, one shell could kill them all. There was no tactic that worked against this new kind of fire, a new level of technical power. To most soldiers in the 1940s, proximity fuses seemed like something out of science fiction. Each one carried a tiny radio transmitter operating at about 180 to 220 megahertz, constantly sending out waves that bounced off the ground, trees, or anything nearby, even people. When the returning signal reached a certain strength, the fuse's electronics triggered the explosion at the perfect height. It all had to work in brutal conditions that would destroy most equipment. When fired, the shell experienced 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to flatten a person to nothing. The shell spun at incredible speed, heated up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the gun barrel, then dropped to freezing temperatures in flight. Yet, thanks to shock-absorbing designs, the delicate vacuum tubes inside still worked over 80% of the time. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground found the ideal burst heights, about 30 feet for 105mm howitzers, 50 feet for 155mm guns, and over 70 feet for the massive 240mm shells, which could wipe out entire areas on their own. The result was overwhelming. Studies showed proximity fuse shells were 5 to 10 times more lethal than normal ones, with a 50-fold increase in the area covered by fragments. In anti-aircraft use, they were even better. The success rate against German V-1 flying bombs jumped from 17% to 79% within weeks. German intelligence missteps. German intelligence completely failed to understand what they were up against. In December 1944, they captured about 20,000 proximity fuse shells from an American ammunition depot. It should have been a goldmine of information. But when German scientists examined the fuses, they refused to believe what they saw. They decided it was impossible for an artillery shell to contain working vacuum tubes that could survive being fired. That disbelief cost them dearly. While American engineers had turned science fiction into reality, German experts dismissed it as a trick, and by the time they realized the truth, the damage was already done. They came to the same conclusion: the Americans weren't using anything like the Germans expected. Some thought it was magnetic detection, or that the visible parts were fake covers hiding a different mechanism. That error came from blind spots in German thinking. Germany had actually worked on proximity fuses before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had prototypes by 1940, but Hitler's ban on projects that would take more than 6 months to produce stopped the effort. German engineers couldn't accept that the Americans had solved problems they themselves had dropped. The irony goes deeper when you look at German tech. Their electrostatic fuses, using changes in capacitance, not radar, tested at about 95% reliability. If development had continued, Germany might have fielded these fuses by 1941. Hermann Göring later admitted in interrogation that German devices were only 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. Christmas brought no relief. On December 25th, German units trying to resupply or reorganize found that the fuses didn't care about holidays. Field kitchens, convoys, and staging areas were shredded without forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired more than 1,000 rounds that day, most with proximity fuses. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers gave fast, accurate fire that hit German units unprepared. Being able to fire effectively at night and in bad weather turned artillery into around-the-clock danger. The psychological effect was huge. German soldiers had learned to move when Allied planes couldn't fly and observers couldn't see them. Proximity fuses took away that safe window. Death could come at any time, in any weather, with nothing but the whistle of shells to warn you. Elite forces met the same fate. On December 21st, Otto Skorzeny's Special Commandos tried to take Malmedy. These were hand-picked troops. The men who had rescued Mussolini nearly caught Tito and slipped behind lines in U.S. uniforms. They were Germany's best. Proximity-fused artillery hit them badly, turning their disguises into death traps. The shells burst overhead with uncanny timing, and the raid failed with heavy losses, ending Skorzeny's offensive work. The effect on morale was striking. Even fanatical SS troops, trained and indoctrinated, were driven to collapse by a weapon they couldn't fight. Some survivors ran straight toward American lines, preferring a quick death over endless bombardment, a total breakdown of discipline among Hitler's elite. The production effort matched the weapon's power. By December 1944, more than 100 U.S. companies had shifted to making fuses. Crosley stopped making refrigerators, Emerson Radio retooled from consumer electronics, and firms like Sylvania, RCA, and GE ran full production lines. Quality control was extreme. Every one of the roughly 130 parts got tested, every solder joint inspected under magnification, and random samples were actually fired to prove they'd survive combat. Anything off-spec was thrown away. The mostly female workforce kept this pace through 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, without knowing what they were building because of tight secrecy. They only knew their work mattered. By late 1944, production hit one fuse every 2 seconds, nonstop. Costs also fell dramatically. In 1942, a fuse cost about $732, more than many workers' yearly pay. By December 1944, mass production cut the price to about $18 while keeping quality high. Over the war, 22 million fuses were made, with some 200,000 used during the Battle of the Bulge. Patton understood the math. His Third Army used proximity fuses as a shock weapon while pushing to relieve Bastogne. Brigadier General Edward Williams, his artillery chief, developed new tactics for them, like time-on-target strikes where many batteries fired so shells landed together. When dozens of proximity fuse shells burst at once at the right height, the effect was terrifying. Germans called it a death knell. From December 22nd to 29th, Patton's forces fired about 50,000 proximity-fused rounds. The firepower helped break German resistance and open a path to Bastogne. Patton summed it up bluntly: "The funny fuse won a battle of the Bulge for us." Elsenborn Ridge was another clear example. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held key ground against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. From December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired roughly 160,000 rounds, about 40,000 of which used proximity fuses. Those fuses, just 25% of the total rounds, caused an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties. The numbers were stark. Proximity fuses multiplied U.S. firepower roughly fourfold. German attacks up the steep, wooded slopes ran into walls of air bursts. Whole companies vanished in seconds, bodies piled so high later attackers had to climb over them. After 3 days, the assault stopped. Even the elite SS units were broken by American technology. Then on January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe tried Operation Bodenplatte, about 900 fighters striking Allied airfields. The Germans surprised many airfields and caught planes on the ground, but when pilots flew back they ran into dense anti-aircraft fire equipped with proximity fuses. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, about 172 were down by flak, much of it using these fuses. The loss rates stunned both sides and left the Luftwaffe unable to recover. Keeping the secret grew impossible. Too many shells had been fired and too many troops had seen their effects. On January 6th, the War Department allowed limited disclosure, and the New York Times reported on a new shell that greatly increased U.S. gun effectiveness without explaining the tech. German intelligence finally realized what existed, but it was too late. A January 10th report from the Foreign Armies West admitted, "The Americans have a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at the best height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused heavy casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." After the war, studies showed how crucial proximity fuses were to victory. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt admitted, "The proximity fuse was the key factor. Our attacks failed not because the Americans were braver, though they fought well, but because their artillery seemed to have eyes." General Asso Manschufel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, also said, "The American artillery terrified our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. Even veteran troops panicked." The numbers confirmed it. Around 200,000 proximity fuse shells were fired, causing roughly 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, about 20% of their total losses. The weapon was 5 to 10 times more effective than regular shells and didn't even need spotters in bad weather. Behind those numbers were real people and immense suffering. Many German soldiers were young boys drafted near the war's end, dying from weapons that seemed to think and find them wherever they hid. On the American side, factory workers who made the fuses also paid a heavy price. Accidents were kept secret for security reasons, and many workers at Crosley, Emerson, and other factories broke down from exhaustion and stress. They built these deadly weapons without knowing what they truly were, carrying that weight in silence. But war forces hard moral choices. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, that number could have been far higher. The war might have lasted longer, and countless more Holocaust victims might have died waiting for liberation. Every day the war ended sooner and saved thousands of innocent lives. The proximity fuse program didn't just change the war, it changed technology forever. The small vacuum tubes created for it laid the groundwork for modern electronics. The strict quality control used in fuse factories became standard practice across industries. The massive coordination of suppliers inspired the first modern supply chain systems. Dr. James Van Allen later used his experience with miniaturization to build satellite instruments and went on to discover the Earth's radiation belts. The radar methods behind the fuse evolved into advanced detection systems. And the idea of a weapon that could sense its surroundings and make a decision became the basis for guided missiles and smart bombs. Every precision weapon today traces its roots back to the proximity fuse, the first device that could decide when to explode. What began in the Ardennes forest grew into the modern era of intelligent warfare. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces retreating. Hitler's final offensive cost his army about 100,000 men and gained nothing. The U.S. suffered 75,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. The proximity fuse had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a game changer. General Eisenhower later said that if the Germans had owned this technology, D-Day might have been impossible. These fuses weren't just an artillery improvement, they represented a total shift in how wars were fought. German troops who faced proximity fuse shells experienced something entirely new: death from above, delivered by shells that seemed alive, turning the very air into a weapon. From Colonel Axelson's first unauthorized use on December 16, 1944, to the 200,000 shells fired across the Ardennes, proximity fuses showed how science could tip the balance of war. The combination of American industry, scientific brilliance, and tactical skill produced a weapon that helped decide the outcome of World War II. The story of the proximity fuse is one of transformation, technological, strategic, and human. It proved that a free, industrialized nation could produce weapons as powerful as any dictatorships, that innovation could overcome larger enemy numbers, and that superior science often decides victory. These lessons shaped not just the end of World War II, but all warfare that followed. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the age of high-tech warfare was born. The deadly math of battle was rewritten by tiny radar sets hidden inside shells, a revolution that still defines modern combat. The German soldiers who died under those airbursts weren't just victims of one battle. They were the first casualties of a new era in war, one that continues to shape our world today.